The topic of the second session is ethics and moral dimension of statecraft. And I'm sure you have all heard of the Sanskrit saying, Yato dharma tato jayaha, or loosely translated, wherever there is dharma, victory will follow or success will follow. Now, of course, we are living in a world which is very much in flux. The global order is fraying. War and conflict is manifesting itself all across the globe. And therefore, the question of ethics and morals and value do become important in any discourse on strategic culture. This is particularly important because the multilateral order, the United Nations system that was set up by the West based on principles contained in the UN Charter, are, in a sense, now being questioned by others. And those countries which, in fact, were supposed to keep the peace have themselves engaged in conflict. The United States and the West in Iraq, China all around its periphery, Russia in the Ukraine. And therefore, as our minister said earlier today, the issue is of importance to countries like us, nations like us, who are making our presence felt on the world stage. And therefore, the question of how you craft a foreign and national security policy which balances interests with values and ethics and morals, I think becomes a central subject. And we have a fantastic panel of people to talk about it. Dr. Amrita Narlikar, I don't have to mention that the Narlikar name is very famous in Pune, a family of scientists, of academics, of intellectuals. But Amrita in particular has broken many ceilings, not just the gender ceiling, but because she heads a major institution in Germany, the linguistic and ethnic ceilings as well. We have Professor Amitabh Mattoo, himself a professor of international relations at one of India's premier universities, JNU, a former vice chancellor of Jammu University, and a very distinguished writer and scholar on international relations. And you have Colonel Gautam, retired from the Indian Armed Forces, and probably one of the authorities on Kautilya's Arthashastra and on a number of other works by ancient Indian leaders who wrote about statecraft. And now, before I invite the speakers, I was asked to just frame some of the context for the discussion on ethical and moral dimensions of statecraft. And because this is an IR conference, I think we have to look at it in foreign and security policy terms. And therefore, I want to begin with a quote from the Kathopanishad. The Kathopanishad is a dialogue between Yama, the god of death, and the young Nachiket about what happens to us after we die. I mean, that's a philosophical question. But one of the key paragraphs in that is when Yama tells him that two options are available to all human beings. You can act to fulfill your desire, something that is desirable or pleasurable, or you can act in a virtuous, righteous, or good manner. And those who are wise choose the righteous path, whereas those who are weak-minded or who are filled with avarice choose the path of doing what is pleasurable or desirable to them. And then he goes on to explain that obviously there are not so good implications for people who do that. I quote this paragraph, this particular shloka from the Kathopanishad because it sort of frames the dilemma for states, kings, rulers, currently governments, about where the balance lies between self-interest or the desire to act to achieve something which is desirable and values and ideals. And I think this is a dilemma which has essentially defines human history. So the first big question of the three questions that I suggested to the panel we should talk about is who draws this line and distinction in foreign policy and statecraft between what is desirable and what is righteous when a state acts in the foreign policy and national security interests. Is it the government that draws that distinction? Is it those who make the law or sit in judgment on us, the legislature or the courts which make that distinction? Is it religion which makes that distinction? Because at the bottom of all religion is dharma, which is values, ethics, and principles. Is it civil society which makes that distinction? So this is really the first question that I suggested to our panelists we should speak about. The second question, which logically flows from this, is are these morals and values which underpin statecraft universal? Is there an identical set of ethics which cuts across all civilizations and all societies? And this is a very pertinent debate today, because the West, the United States, will tell you there are universal values: human rights, rule of law, democracy, something that all of us should follow if we all want to be part of the civilized world in the 21st century. And then you have the People's Republic of China, which says there are no universal values, but talks of Asian values. Most recently in July, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in a discussion with the Japanese and the Koreans, has talked of the principle of inclusive Asian values. Then you have, if you look at the ASEAN's Human Rights Declaration, it talks of universal values, but I want to quote from it. The ASEAN Declaration says that at the same time, the realization of human rights must be considered in the regional and national context, bearing in mind different political, economic, legal, social, cultural, historical, and religious backgrounds. So where and what is India's perspective on whether there is a universality of values or whether there is an individuality, in the sense that each nation state has its own values to follow, and therefore is ethics and values in foreign policy and national security policy solely rooted within one's own culture, or is it something which is universal and your culture doesn't matter? I think that's the second big question which I hope our panelists will talk about. And finally, the third question I framed from them is that we are living in a globalized world. As the world globalizes and boundaries blur, every act that a state does in terms of foreign policy or national security policy affects other states and other countries and other societies around you. And therefore, whose ethics and morals will prevail? Is it going to be the ethics and morals of the strongest? And here, there is the story in the Mahabharata when after the Pandavas have lost Draupadi in the game of dice and she's being dishonored, and she asks Bhishma Pitama, who is the patriarch of the Kuru tribe, to act in accordance with dharma. And Bhishma Pitama says, well, when the powerful act, then that is dharma. And when the feeble-minded or the weak talk of dharma, nobody really listens to them. So the question is might is right the only way in which dharma is going to be decided, values are going to be decided? Is it the most powerful and consequential countries in the world who will decide what is the ethics and values we should follow? Or is there a place for other nations or groups of nations who may be middle powers or emerging economies or significant regional countries to also talk of their own national foreign and defense policies based on the moral authority and ideals that they follow? So these, ladies and gentlemen, were the three questions that I framed for our speakers. And I will now invite Dr. Amrita Narlikar, who is the main speaker, to make a presentation of about 25 minutes or half an hour, and then the two discussants will follow. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Narlikar, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gokhale. I hope I have 30 minutes to speak, which is what the organizers had told me to aim for. I will be very punctual with my timing. So, Honorable Minister Dr. Jaishankar, dear Director Lavare, thank you for the kind invitation to this important and timely exchange. And dear co-panelists, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to join you. It would have been even better to be there in person with you all, but sadly, flight connections did not allow it this time. Nonetheless, I am looking forward to making the most of the digital options that are available to us and engaging in a lively conversation together. So, as you can see from the first slide, my talk today is called Discovering Squared Circles, Ethics and Realpolitik in Indian Strategic Thought. And I will be focusing on questions of foreign policy with a goal of highlighting exactly what the Honorable Minister asked us to do this morning. Think about international relations with Indian characteristics, with Bharatiya characteristics. So my argument, as you can see from the second slide, develops in 4 parts. I'll first identify the how not tos of ethics in foreign policy. As a second step, I will give you some examples of how tos, drawing on India's ancient wisdom. In aggregate, these examples illustrate an innovative agenda for foreign policy and strategy, which allows us to reconcile, in my eyes, some tough issues of ethics and realpolitik, and which India can uniquely bring to the global negotiating table. As a third step, I will elaborate on the benefits of this approach. And finally, I will discuss the implications of my argument for theory and practice. So the first step in my argument, the how not tos. The Chatham House Journal International Affairs held a competition to celebrate its centenary anniversary. Ours was one of the 2 winning teams, and Dan Dresner's and my special issue is on the subversive topic of the how not to guide for international relations. This special issue that you see in front of you was published last year. And I must point out that the central premise of this special issue, the centenary special issue of a leading British and international journal, was in fact inspired by the Indian philosophy of negation, na iti or neti. The special issue has an international group of authors contributing to it, including the wonderful Professor Mattoo, who joins us on this panel from Melbourne today. And in this special issue, what we argued was that a more systematic knowledge of what does not work can provide valuable insights on what could work, both for scholarship and for policymaking. And so taking a leaf out of this special issue, and I'm going to now apply this approach to the issue at hand. So the how not tos of ethics and foreign policy, na iti, and I'm going to identify 3 false and costly dichotomies. So the first false and costly dichotomy is values versus interests. And this is prevalent in academic and policy debates in a big way. There is no dearth of researchers arguing, for instance, that to deal with the rising China, the United States and other powers will be better served finding allies based on shared interests. Powerful business lobbies, as well as political leaders in Europe, emphasize the importance of not jeopardizing high profits secured via the Chinese market. And they are quite willing, after some token lip service, to look the other way as far as human rights, or indeed animal rights, or indeed violations of the spirit of trade rules, or indeed adventurism in the neighboring seas are concerned. So the argument is, let's look after our interests. Yeah, we'll do a little bit of lip service to values and then move on with our interests. A slightly more refined version of this argument was Bundel durch Handel in Germany, It was assumed that by prioritizing economic interests via trade and increasing interconnectedness, it would also be possible to bring about political change and convergence over values. We now know that this strategy has not worked, as the EU is slowly but surely beginning to recognize. In fact, some of these mistakes, especially of overdependence of the EU, and indeed many in the global south too, on China, this might not have happened if instead of assuming that interests and values are somehow separate, it was recognized that values and interests are reflexive. They are mutually constitutive, with one shaping the other. There are indeed strands of international relations theory that emphasize this reflexivity, but unfortunately have not often been so impactful on policymaking. In the same vein, let's take another example. The challenge from China stems not only from its rapid economic rise, rather, it derives from the fact that its growth is founded on a model of development, a political system, and indeed a worldview of order that are fundamentally at odds with not only the West, but also its own neighbors in the region. If we're serious about protecting our interests, we cannot afford to ignore our values. The second dichotomy, this one is on Asian values versus universal values. And it's another example of how not to talk about ethics, at least if we are interested in gains for India and its allies, its partners in the West. Now, with good reason, this narrative of Asian versus universal has flourished in certain parts of Southeast Asia as well as China. And the West has all too readily accepted this crude reductionism for its convenience and sometimes due to misguided political correctness. India, however, offers an interpretation of human rights that is more inclusive and more absolute than that of Western liberalism. As per key variants of Indian philosophy, human rights are not only human, but they extend to all living beings. This puts the Indian version not only at the extreme and beautiful end of the liberal version of human rights, but also at the opposite end of the spectrum from China and others in Southeast Asia, because this is all about the rights of the individual being. A failure to recognize this very basic differentiation is unfair to India, which ends up being grouped with China and others, and at the receiving end of the civilizing mission from the self-styled guardians of liberalism in the West. It's also deeply counterproductive for the West because it allows countries in Europe, especially in Europe, to indulge in misguided self-perceptions of their being the primary source of pluralism, of democracy, of human rights, and all other things that we hold dear. And for both India and the West, partnerships then fail to reach their potential, partnerships that might be especially important amidst the geopolitical and geoeconomic imbalance of power that we are faced with. And the third unhelpful dichotomy is between principles versus transactionalism. Now, long having been criticized for being a tough and inflexible negotiator, and also having recognized the limits of an ideological approach, there is a temptation to swing in the other direction and assess every issue in purely transactional terms. The prioritization of pragmatism over values, however, diminishes the tremendous soft power that India could harness to shape its relations with other value-based partners, such as the EU, creating virtuous cycles of deeper cooperation amongst like-minded states. And the fact is, just as it doesn't need to be values versus interests, so also we do not have to choose between principles versus pragmatism. I would argue it is possible, indeed even necessary, to have both. Principles are what I see as a first-order matter, which form the foundations of foreign policy and strategy, while issue-specific transactions are an important but second-order matter on which more flexibility can and should be shown. So now from Kim iti, now from neti actually, we've just done the how not to, let's come to the how to and what to, so Kim iti and Katham iti. So now I'm going to draw on India's ancient texts to offer a different take on ethics, particularly first-order principles, which help us overcome some of the dichotomies, some of the problems that I've just identified. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on our forthcoming book on the Mahabharata. Additionally, I'm also deliberately using other texts, not esoteric tomes that occupy mainly the mind of a scholar and dusty bookshelves in libraries, but works that form a part of our living culture and verses that many of us have learned as part of our childhood experiences and school curricula. So the first one, and this is about leadership style in foreign policy. Let me start off with a favorite shlok of mine, which is from Bhartrihari's Niti Shatak, the book of 100 verses relating to policy and public issues. And the shlok goes like this. Nindantu niti nupunaha yadi vastuvantu lakshmihi samavishatu gacchatu va yatheshtam adyaiva maranamastu yugantare va nyayat pathaha pravichalanti padam nadhiraha. And that roughly translates as irrespective of whether the great and the good of this world shower them with praise or criticism, whether wealth accrues to them or leaves them of its own accord, whether they have to meet death today or centuries later. Wise people do not let their feet stray from the path of truth and righteousness. Now, this shlok is useful in many situations of everyday life, but it is especially relevant in my eyes for questions of global leadership and what it means to be souverain as a major power. To some extent, we have seen India demonstrating a style of global leadership that is already infused with this sentiment. This is evident, for example, in the World Trade Organization, another area of my research, where India is leading the cause on access to COVID-related medicines, vaccines, and treatments, as well as the key issue of public stockholding and food security. And while India is already familiar with this approach of standing one's ground when needed, more, I would argue, can be made of this, both internally and externally. And I will try to suggest how in the fourth part of my talk. And one clarification, this leadership style does not mean not engaging with partners. It also does not mean not responding to feedback, but it does mean standing true to oneself. And this refers to both values and interests. Which brings me to the second example on values and interests. Now, I've already indicated to you what's wrong with the values and interests dichotomy. The Mahabharata gives us a different perspective. Dharma eva hato hanti dharmo rakshati rakshitaha. When dharma, due to your values, is destroyed, it also destroys. Dharma protects those who guard it. Dharmo rakshati rakshitaha. Now, this oft-quoted line comes from the famous Yaksha Prashna episode of the Mahabharata. It suggests not a shallow understanding of values. It tells us instead to take a strong position that comes from a deep understanding of interests that are firmly rooted in values and evolve accordingly. Yudhishthir's insight makes it clear that if we protect our values, our interests will also be protected. Now, applied to foreign policy, global governance, and multilateralism, applied fully, and Yudhishthir's insight is very interesting and significant. It turns the fundamental assumption of the post-war order on its head, that is, economic integration automatically will lead to the values that most countries say they care about at a very general level, prosperity and peace. That's the old assumption. Here we have Yudhishthir telling us something and asking us to look at the world in a different way. It doesn't say that interests bring about changes to values. It says the opposite. It says protect your values and your interests will be protected according to this verse. And what are the policy prescriptions that follow? We don't get technocratic and economic drivers, but political and moral drivers for peace. Not universal integration amongst a great diversity of partners, but deep integration amongst like-minded allies. Not further opening of markets and freer flow of goods per se, but closer trade links with countries that share one's values. And above all, and leaving aside all the intricacies that dharma is very sukshma, Yudhishthir's experience collapses the interest versus values dichotomy into one powerful lesson. Sometimes it pays to be good. I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to skip the third and the fourth points right now, but I'm very happy to elaborate in Q&A. Let me go to point 5 on the slide on ecologism and animal rights. Now, much is made of family and society-oriented Asian values in that whole Asian versus universal values debate, right? And so the argument is Asian values are family-oriented, they're society-oriented, in contrast to individual-oriented universal values. Traditional India, our ancient texts offer quite a different, indeed much more liberal, much more individualistic perspective on this issue, more so than even Western variants, because they accord individual personality and rights to all creatures. So, for example, and I'm going to now cite a shlok that many of you will know or will know a part of it because it's occurred several times in the conversation today already. Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana laghu chetasam udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. This is mine, this is yours. Only mean-minded people indulge in such bean counting. For the generous-minded, the entire earth is one family. This second line, or part of that second line, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, many translate roughly as the world is one family. And this line is also found international take-up, with global leaders such as Obama also embracing it. I was very happy to learn today that this is a motto that Symbiosis is also committed to. India took the took the G20 a big step forward by giving it the theme of One Earth, One Family, One Future, inspired by this idea. And our PM Modi's concept of lifestyle for the environment also reflects this. And I had the honor to be a part of Task Force 3, a T20 task force, Task Force 3 on life, well-being, and values. And this theme was reflected in the G20 processes and outcomes, also in the Delhi Declaration. But in fact, this idea goes even further. I would argue considerably further than the uses it has been put to thus far. Now, most translate the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam into the world as a family. And they think this refers to all peoples of the world. But in fact, Vasudha refers to the planet as a whole and all the beings, human, and call them non-human, or as I would prefer, more than human. It refers to all the more than human beings to which this planet is a home. And this is an ambitious and a much more inclusive, genuinely inclusive understanding of the word family. It is a non-anthropocentric perspective. A non-anthropocentric appreciation of family, welfare, justice, and rights is deeply enshrined in ancient Indian texts. It flourishes to this day in the verses that we are taught. As part of learning at home, but also in formal Sanskrit classes in a convent school in Delhi, I imbibed the idea of Atmavat Sarva Bhuteshu Yaha Pashyati Saha Panditaha. He who looks upon all beings as he looks upon himself, he is the truly wise one. This non-anthropocentric perspective is very different. It's very different from Fridays for Future demonstrations prompted by Greta Thunberg's climate activism. So in contrast to children in the West demanding that the planet be saved for their future, or adults appealing to intergenerational justice on behalf of their children and their children's children and their children's children's children, and so on and so forth, the Indian approach that I've just outlined seeks not just intergenerational justice, but trans-species justice. It applies to the cause of biodiversity, and not only for the sake of preservation of a particular species, but to save the lives of individual animals within species. It asks to consider and mitigate not only human suffering, but also to go beyond and mitigate more than human suffering. When speaking of One Health, besides all the key issues that the G20 Delhi Declaration raises, we would also be focusing on the importance of protecting the health of other species, not least in the context of zoonotic jumping and pandemic prevention. Because that is the ambition that is entailed in the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This is a different and a much needed innovative agenda for global order and global governance. I'm going to skip the example on food security and globalization in the interest of time, but let me move on now. So to slide number 6, please. Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to move on to from Kathamiti to Kimarthamiti. Why this approach matters. I don't think I need to alert this audience to the multiple crises that the world faces today. Some of them are existential if you think about the decline in biodiversity, climate change, security threats that emanate not only from conventional security threats, but from the weaponization of interdependence, from the securitization of trade. And frankly speaking, I've had enough of being lectured to on how the world needs a rule-based system. That is just such a platitude. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. Rules-based system, yes, but much depends on which rules and whose rules, and are those rules still fit for purpose? The agenda that I've highlighted, a uniquely Indian agenda for international relations, for IR, has the potential to offer fresh, innovative ideas to deal with these existential crises, to reboot and re-energize the system of multilateral rules, to inject new levels of justice and a much more inclusive understanding of justice in a way that has never been done before. And I would argue that this is exactly what the world needs if it is to survive. The approach will naturally be of advantage to India. It originates in India. It will be one that India will offer thought leadership on, and indeed, action leadership on. It will also be of great support to old and new partners and friends of India, because it allows us to reinforce and also reshape and cement shared values, shared interests based on those values. Our own Indian traditions offer us some powerful ideas, concepts for strategic thought. The agenda that I offer you now comes from stories and verses that are deeply integrated in our mentalite, in our psyche. This narrative is a potential source of incredible power. It should be tapped. It can be tapped. It can be harnessed. That said, implementing such an agenda will not be easy. We need an action plan for both researchers and practitioners. So, some ideas on this now. So if we could have the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So first, for theory. Now, something that I'm arguing for across different projects that I'm a part of in Europe and the USA. It's extremely important that researchers, especially those in the West, but also those of different ideological proclivities in the Global South and in India, that researchers reconsider the skewed, narrow, and still rather imperialist histories and narratives of liberalism. We need neither the superiority complexes of the West that assume that their own cultures are the source of all things good and liberal, from which the Global South is just waiting to learn, nor do we need their guilt complexes that require us to reject some of our own ancient roots of liberal ideas. What we need is recognition, ownership, and clear red lines, all of which go considerably beyond the cultural relativism that most well-meaning of such attempts until now have entailed. And second, one of the reasons why this type of research and policy impact is difficult is because of the disciplinary silos that we operate in. Perhaps it's not surprising that most discussions on the origins of liberalism in India go back to British rule, because to trace indigenous liberal ideas to their ancient roots requires knowledge of Sanskrit and philosophy that most political scientists and perhaps also intellectual historians of the 19th century seldom have. And further, those engaged in these ancient debates are not so engaged with political scientists and economists working on the problems of the present day. So we need interdisciplinary research. We need Renaissance holistic approaches besides narrow specialisms. We need to get out of our comfort zones, and we need much more scholar and practitioner exchange. So I've, sort of done a little bit of self-flagellation for my field, for academia in general, to what needs to be done to really embrace and adopt this agenda that I've advanced. But what about practice? And here I have two suggestions again. The first very important point is about owning this agenda. And internationally, this means pushing back against being put in the Asian corner of the Asian versus universal values debate. This is not a debate on our terms. We need to be setting the debate. And we can do so by showing how our values are actually fundamentally different from, the Asian ones. Also, a part of the owning the agenda is standing up for the values that we believe in, as I've outlined in the second part of my talk, and embracing the reflexivity of values and interests, also to our strategic advantage. For instance, in partnerships that we choose to deepen and the narratives we choose to build. Another implication for practice. Now, all foreign policy is, for better and for worse, closely connected with domestic politics. And the linkage between the domestic and international should not be underestimated, not only as a negative thing, but also as an opportunity. So a part of this involves lead globally by domestic example. So for instance, on the issue of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, take the upcoming G20s, the G20 summits in Brazil, and likely South Africa, to push for not just human-centric development, but planet-centric development. And in parallel, domestically, amend the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 60, PCA 60, throw the live exports-imports bill completely out of the window, not be on the side of states that lack laws and cultures of animal welfare and protection, but embrace and share India's civilizational vision that accords rights and personhood to more than humans. Also relating to this idea that of the linkage between foreign policy and domestic politics, many of the ideas that I've just outlined are not only illustrative of India's strategic thinking, but they also tap into the culture and civilization and what I talked about as the lived culture and the living culture that is India. Appealing to such indigenous, homegrown thought will resonate also with people on the ground, thereby reinforcing the domestic legitimacy of India's foreign policy and ensuring a key sync in this multi-level game. So that's it for now. And maybe the last slide, please. Thank you. If you want to have more food for thought on the Mahabharata and India's foreign policy and negotiation, please have a look here. The first book on your left was published in 2014 with Oxford University Press. The new one is coming out at the end of this month, published by Penguin Random House. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amrita. That was a masterful presentation, and your definition of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as extending to all life on the planet, I think, is a very interesting interpretation. And also your point that if we protect values, then our interests will also be protected. Can I invite Professor Amitabh Mattoo, who is the first discussant, to join us now? Amitabh, you have 15 minutes. If you could wrap up in 15 minutes. Thank you. Your floor is yours.
Amitabh, you're muted.
You're muted. We can't hear you, Amitabh.
Check. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Honorable External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, Ambassador Gokhale, Director Lavale, my distinguished fellow panelists and the lead speaker, Professor Narlikar, Colonel Gautam, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and honored to be part of this really path-breaking conference with a stellar cast of speakers. I think Symbiosis has done itself really proud to organize this. And at Pune, I have a deep regard for scholarship from Pune. It's often said that if institutions had hearts, the Mahabharata would belong to the Bandharkar Oriental Research Institute. I don't know how many within Symbiosis visit Bori, but the greatest work of scholarship in contemporary times that I am aware of was the development of the critical edition of the Mahabharata by Professor Suktankar, then Belvalkar, Day, and Dandekar. And it's really a manuscript which all those who are interested in understanding Indian thought, Indian thinking, stemming from the Mahabharata should familiarize themselves with. It was released in 1966 by Dr. Radhakrishnan. I also want to flag another great scholar, Maharashtrian scholar, but who did a lot of work in the Asiatic Society in Mumbai, but also at Bori, Professor Pandurang Vaman Kane, who was Vice Chancellor of the University of Mumbai and Bombay then, and who's written a 5-volume history of Dharma Shastra. And anyone, again, who wants to understand India's strategic culture and thought must really read at least parts of Professor Kane's work. Incidentally, in this day when we seem to have a historical amnesia, often Professor Kane was awarded the Bharat Ratna in 1963, if I'm right. So I would have thought that both Bori and Dharma Shastra would have figured in the discourse, but I know that Professor Narlikar, who is a world authority on India's international relations, understands both the many different attempts at the Bengal school as well as the Bori Mahabharata. And it's been an honor to co-author this book with on strategic choices and ethical dilemmas. Just to do another plug for our book, Stories from the Mahabharata, which I have had the honor of writing jointly with Dr. Aruna Narlikar and Professor Amrita Narlikar, both great scholars on the subject. Since I'm flagging books, let me also flag Professor Narlikar's and Dr. Aruna Narlikar's earlier book on bargaining with the rising India, but also a book which again doesn't seem to find mention here, which actually was edited with my colleague Kanti Bajpai on Securing India, which was the only volume which brought together scholars from India debating Tanham's 2 essays in 1992. In fact, Tanham was part of that project, and it was the only serious attempt at examining his central thesis. Indian elites show little evidence of having thought coherently and systematically about national strategy. It is a sweeping generalization about a country which Tanham conceded does not easily admit to a broad generalization that had generated a controversy. And during those days, Tanham had found a powerful ally in India's strategic guru, K. Subramaniam, who in his review of the study argued that the absence of strategic traditions had resulted in ad hocism all around. Of course, he was talking about contemporary times, about the absence of defense planning, of the absence of institutions which systematically thought about grand strategy or indeed about security and strategy in a systematic fashion other than the Committee of Secretaries. This, of course, predated even the National Security Council Secretariat or the Office of the National Security Advisor. Ambassador Gokhale, you have laid out a fantastic agenda and you put forward detailed questions for us. and Professor Narlikar has made a masterly presentation, which I can only both endorse and agree with in its entirety, especially on taking a non-anthropocentric view of even Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But I will do what I used to do when I appeared in my friend Arnab Goswami's show, and you had 5 minutes to make your point. Say your piece without really addressing the question or really addressing the presentation before you. So with due respect, Ambassador Gokhale, I hope you'll allow me that flexibility, which Arnab Goswami may not have allowed me. So there are 3 or 4 points that I'll make. First, again, on George Tanham. Tanham's essay was commissioned by the Under-Secretary of Defense, and it suggested that the absence of Indian strategic thinking is because of India's geography, culture, and history. This, frankly, is and remains baloney. This is, for anyone who understands India's history, India's culture, this seemed to be a gross generalization, as I pointed out. And in fact, if you met with Tanham, you realize that his understanding of India, its culture and geography and history, was even more superficial than what he had written about. For every cultural trait or historical factor that Tanham believed had inhibited the development of Indian strategic thinking, one can easily identify an opposing trait or factor which should have promoted such thinking. But the problem with Tanham's view of Indian history, and the problem with many of the interpretations of India's strategic culture, is that it was based on what might be described as Tanham's interviews or conversations with the India International Center's strategic elite's view of India. It looked at a Delhi-centric view rather than a view of India in all its entirety. And the critique that Alastair Ian Johnston, the China expert, made of the first generation of writers on strategic culture holds good for Tanham as well. The alleged homogeneity of a society's strategic culture across time is problematic. It seems somewhat muddled to argue that a single strategic culture emerges from its multiple inputs when each of these inputs could produce alternative, even contradictory strategic cultures. It would be more logical, and I say this in the context of India, to conclude that diversity of a particular society's geographical, political, cultural, and strategic experience will produce multiple strategic cultures, a possibility excluded by the kind of narrow determinism of George Tanham. So I would argue, and I think someone else made the point, that we need to look at the multiplicity of strategic cultures. There is no meta-narrative which we should believe in. In fact, there are little traditions which I'll point out in my conclusion, which we should focus on as well. The second point is about the Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata is a book, as I pointed out, that we have written on. I have argued elsewhere, and this brings out, of course, the moral versus the moral dimensions of conflict. I have argued elsewhere that if all the books on war and peace were to suddenly disappear from the world and only the Mahabharata remained, it would be good enough to capture almost all the possible debates on order, justice, force, and the moral dilemmas associated with the choices that are made on these issues within the realm of international politics. My own understanding of the Mahabharata and the moral choices was inspired by Bimal Krishan Matilal, the Oxford philosopher, former professor of Spalding Religions at All Souls College, Oxford, who wrote this masterly essay in defense of devious divinity. Really an examination of the choices of the advice that Krishna gives to Arjuna. But I argue that today, as India confronts some of its biggest strategic challenges, there are deep insights about the Mahabharata that the Mahabharata offers us, including from Krishna, who in his mortal form is the ultimate strategic visionary, a political genius who believes in what we have been talking about, upholding the dharma almost at any cost. What does dharma mean, particularly in terms of strategic vision? One, dharma means upholding the larger righteous interests. the welfare of humanity, and if, as Amrita pointed out, the welfare of the planet, both in its mundane and transcendental sense. For the leadership of a nation state, it means protecting the national interests defined as not just the interests of the people, but of all human beings, a non-anthropocentric view of national interests from internal and external adversarial circumstances. Second, dharma means action, not passivity, acting without material incentives and without regard for narrowly defined gains from that action, and acting decisively while recognizing that the war for upholding dharma will almost necessarily always cause collateral damage, both in terms of a strict adherence to principles as well as possibly unrestrained violence. Three, the war of dharma requires acting independently, without attachment, without fear, and without external pressure. In sum, dharma and foreign policy can be only sustained, and I know this is provocative and needs to be debated, through the doctrine of strategic autonomy. Dharma, I believe, in foreign policy can only be sustained through a doctrine of strategic autonomy. It's the only principle that can bring into harmony flexibility in diplomacy, even diplomacy when needed, and purposeful violence when required. So much so that true statecraft and strategic autonomy become inseparable, bringing about a fusion of thought and action for the higher purposes of statecraft. Dharma is beyond self-interest, it's beyond partisan causes, it's concerned almost with the larger good. It reifies humanity, the people, and as I said, all living beings, and not necessarily the state. As Krishna emphasizes to Arjuna, you have a right to act, but never to any fruits thereof. You should never be motivated by the results of your actions, nor should there be an attachment. In contemporary terms, what are the secular aspects of wisdom that Krishna imparts to Arjuna, particularly in the Bhagavad Gita? As I said, ultimately for Krishna, strategic policies must be rooted in the framework of dharma and promoting the larger interests. Yato dharma, tato jaya, victory and dharma go together rather than any selfish or partisan cause. In many ways, this wisdom reinforces, as I said, India's long-standing quest for autonomy, defined as the pursuit of stability, space, and strength as an instrument for promoting national dharma. As an illustrative example, even at the end of his teaching and his call for action, Krishna encourages Arjuna to reflect and to introspect on what he has learned and discard what he finds unsuitable. Thus, I have explained to you the most confidential of knowledge. Deliberate on this fully and then do what you wish to do. In terms of moral philosophy, and this is very important for the purposes of this panel, with deep implications for statecraft, contemporary concerns about Krishna's behavior or advice are similar to the one raised by the sage Utanka. When he encounters Krishna after the war, why does Krishna not successfully broker peace between the warring cousins rather than preside over genocide? Why does Krishna undermine his stature by apparently resorting to duplicitous or even deceitful means in the course of war? Matilal and others offer compelling explanations to coherently justify Krishna's actions, including those rooted in moral consequentialism and the lack of omnipotence of the Lord when he acquires an earthly form. Krishna is the final guardian of dharma, a leader, and on occasion, as Professor Matilal points out, a leader needs to create new paradigms for showing limitations of such a generally accepted moral code of truth-telling and promise-keeping. The third point, and it's the second last point, India through most of its history, Sabhyata, Sanskriti, and Rashtra have cohabited in synergy and harmony. Civilization is the advancement in the social, material, and other indicators of the quality of life. Culture is your way of life, and Rashtra is the state represented by your geographical boundaries as well as the constitution and other institutions. Cartographic divisions, cultural aberrations may seem to at moments cast a shadow, but if you look at the long term, a 5,000-year view, you can plot a graph which is not given to extreme swings. Culture has always, all along, been an intervening variable in India's foreign and security policy. The prism, the filter through which material interests and power capabilities are translated into policy. In contemporary terms, it was as true about a Nehruvian view as it is about Prime Minister Modi's worldview. Finally, there are sources other than the ones that we have talked about, Arthashastra, Mahabharata, and others, and the Puranas, that we need to pay attention to. I know one text, such as the Nilmat Purana from Kashmir, dated to about 6th century Christian era, which opens with Janmejay's inquiry from Vespayana as to why the king of Kashmir did not participate in the war of the Mahabharata, although his kingdom was not less important than any other in the country. Through that question is explored almost all aspects of spiritual and material and strategic life. But I doubt whether the Nilmat Purana figures in any syllabus in our strategic courses anywhere in India. So I would argue that there is a lot of work to be done, a lot of work that cannot be done instantly, but which requires a great deal of time, energy, and patience. I remember what another great resident of Pune, Apasaheb Pant, once told me, as he explained the Surya Namaskar and said that this is a practice which can be learned in 3 days, but understanding Indian philosophy or understanding ancient Himalayan philosophy takes a long time. He said when the 13th Dalai Lama was told by the British resident's wife in Lhasa that Amelia Earhart had crossed the Atlantic in 20 hours, all that His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked her is, Madam, why was she in such a hurry? The important thing is that we need to have knowledge is not something that can be gained instantly. It requires patience, it requires understanding, and it requires scholarship. And I'm delighted that there are diplomats engaged with the business of scholarship and knowledge transfer. But I think what they need to also recognize is that academics have a place in this discourse. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And of course, the key point you made of dharma in foreign policy only being sustained by strategic autonomy is, of course, something that needs to be looked at more carefully. Colonel Gautam, as the second discussant, may I ask you to take the floor? Thank you.
Honorable External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, Ambassador Gokhale, Chair, Professor Majumdar, who founded this university and his staff, and Professor Shivali and the team. Firstly, thank you for inviting me here and giving me a chance to be a discussant. So, the theory of discussant, which I'd learned in IDA, says that you read the paper and thrash it. But since no paper was shared, I totally agree with both the speakers. Very totally minor variations in biodiversity and animal. We see, I thought Pune would be, but there was huge pollution here. And in 66, I was in Khadakwasa. It was a non-fan station. So very rapidly, Prithvi is goddess Prithvi is getting hit. So so let's forget it. So what I have done is, I have got about 9 slides. 5 points I'm going to discuss. Text and traditions, continuity of military ethos. I thought I am one of the military types here, so let me give the use of force and the dharma there, which also is a part of foreign policy. Then the debate on dharma, arth and kam. It goes on and on, it'll never finish. And finally, getting rid of the institution of war. Professor Upadhyay is here, a peace researcher sitting with us. And everybody writes PhD on war, an Israeli scholar told me. Very few write PhDs on peace research. So the next slide. Yeah. So text and tradition. So in Indian tradition, ancient tradition, warcraft and statecraft were common. But the baseline or the basic structure is built on dharma. Dharma or moral or ethical values are part of the habitus, which Saurabh Mishra mentioned, and the subconscious in Indian culture as they are embedded in epics, text, and traditions. These experience saturated, that is a word late Dr. Michael Liebig used here in 2018. that he said Kautilya and Arthashastra is experience saturated. So all this is experience saturated, and I will now give few examples. First, the concept of dharma, earth and calm. So dharma is of course supreme. Tirikural argues that aram, dharma, which regulates the need to check both poral, that is artha, and imbam, that is kama, at all and any level. And then Radhakrishnan asserts the beautiful explanation of dharma is a code. The shortage of time, I'll just read out few sentences. Dharma is a code of conduct supported by general conscience of the people. Then he goes on to say it's not a mechanical thing. It is not forced upon you, but it sort of evolves. So that is the beauty of dharma. In fact, physicists say second law of thermodynamics is also dharma. So that is the interesting part of dharma. Okay. Then in Arthashastra, Kautilya talks of 3 types of conquests. First is dharma vijay, that is just conqueror. Then is the just conqueror is satisfied with mere obeisance. Distinguished from dharma vijayi, that is a just conqueror, is a lobha vijayi, who fights out of covetousness, jealousy and greed for land or money. And the worst type is asuru vijayi. So Kautilya has theorized these three because this is the way he saw the world happening, and unfortunately the world has not changed. Same thing is continuing. C. Kautilya Arthashastra is in conformity with the international humanitarian norms and laws of war. That is jus in bello and also jus post bellum. That is rules of how conquered people are to be assimilated and treated. Next, apad dharma. This dharma of distress. This is also in our subconscious. And I'll give an example. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi did not renounce the inherent right of states to defend themselves when attacked. Indian intervention in Kashmir in 1947 had his tacit approval. So the Dalai Lama also says that if I'm standing to catch a metro and somebody pushes me from behind, so I'll push back, isn't it? So this is apad dharma. Next, Kautilya celebrates ethical and moral power at council at 7.5.16. And he says, this is interesting, when the choice is between a strong king unjustly behaved and a weak king justly behaved, he should march against the strong king unjustly behaved. So this is the example from our text and tradition. So now I'll come to something on military ethos. Field Marshal Rommel, the German leader of the African Corps during North African campaign in Second World War, followed the rules of war and demonstrated how an unjust war waged by Adolf Hitler can be fought justly. And Indian Army, a lot of divisions participated in North African campaign with excellent performance. So there's a theory of surrender, says that soldiers are most likely to surrender when they perceive that the proximate environment signals from which they expect humane treatment and a relatively short period of captivity. They are least likely to give up if those signals they know that there will be no abusive treatment or lengthy imprisonment. And this is what Manekshaw also did in the 71 war. He kept on announcing that surrender, surrender, we look after you, which helped us to liberate Bangladesh. General Shankar Roy Chaudhary, another former chief, emphasizes in his writing that the bedrock of leadership, power in military continues to be the grand traditional principle of Nishkam Karma, unselfish work. From the Gita, Izzat or Imam, honor and honesty from the Quran, and the soldier and saint have much in common in the theme of Sant Sipahi. Squadron leader China captures the inherent subconscious habitus of moral and ethics of the Indian Armed Forces in the 3 components of fighting power: conceptual, physical, and moral. In moral or dharma, it includes sarv dharma sambhava, that is, all beliefs can coexist. And the reason to fight as naam, namak, and nishan, That is name or honor, salt or fidelity, and color of the regiment. Now, in last month, there was a military literature festival, and General V.K. Sharma, who was the chief of the army staff in the 1980s, in that book discussion, he's written a foreword in that book of the role of the Armored Corps in the 71 war. It's a fantastic paragraph which I have quoted, but shortage of time, I'll just briefly talk what he's saying. It's easy to start a war, but once you start it, very difficult to terminate. A good general should achieve the national aim of minimum loss of men and material both to itself and the enemy. And hating the enemy must be avoided, as this never destroys the masses of human, and aim should never be to destroy the masses of human population. And wars are started by political leaders, but the military executes them, so they are not blameworthy except when they indulge in cruelty, rapine, and pointless destruction. So military leaders must become aware and never give illegal orders. Unfortunately, European wars, we are doing sort of Western bashing, so here it is. European wars follow total destructive philosophy, as we observed in the 2 world wars, and now Ukraine. The only result is great anger and revenge and conflict. The UN Charter also requires signatories to abstain from crossing militarily into other nations. If there is a real desire on peace on earth, nations need to follow these principles. So now I'll just give my next point. So the debate on dharma, arth, and kam. Chief has said that, I have said this, that's all fine, but let's see what the Mahabharata says. Post the victory, Yudhishthira asks others to judge what is supreme. So Vidura, the common uncle, says dharma. Arjun, it's artha. For him, artha is supreme. Nakul and Sahdev, the twins, acknowledge artha, but then they argue that let's press first for virtue, so that we get arth and kam. Bhim, of course, we all know, bids for desire, that is kama. Yudhishthira then rejects all of them and gives priority to moksha. So that means this debate is there. It's not resolved. So what did poor fellow Vyas say in the end? He ends the Mahabharata by saying this. He ended the Mahabharata with a lament. Here I am crying out with uplifted arms that dharma brings it with both earth and kam, but no one listens to me. And therefore, Apastamma, his stanza is important. Now, how to figure out dharma in contemporary times has been given by Apastamma, the ancient author of the Dharma Sutra. It says, dharma and adharma do not go about saying, here we are, nor do gods and Gandharvas or ancestors tell us, this is dharma and this is adharma. So the question now is, so the text allows all types of views and arguments in support. Kautilyan dimensions of power or Shakti can also be traced to Ramayana as Mantra Shakti, Prabhava Shakti, and Utsa Shakti. Each can manifest itself as Deva Shakti or divine power or Asura Shakti or demonic power. What is the crux? The crux is those hands that wield power must wear the safety glove of dharma. So this is all in our text. Our great scholars have analyzed dharma and the debates and the powerful concept of dharma. So this is that velvet, iron fist in a velvet glove. So this is, I think, this is a better one. That hand that wields the power must wear the safety glove of dharma. So now I come to before I conclude, getting rid of the institution of war. Mohandas Gandhi created a new political canon, drawing and reviving ancient Indian traditions and values based on upeksha, which is the 5th upaya. He gave 7 social sins. That is, politics without principles, wealth without work. These are social ills, I repeat, social ills. Politics without principles, wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, science without humanity, worship without sacrifice. But banishing of social evils would be very difficult combined with the dominance of the tendency of Matsya Nyaya, Kajri Kamal did mention that law of the fish. So Gandhi then makes love one of the two forms of power. One is obtained by fear of punishment, and the other by acts of love. So Machiavelli says it is a king should be feared. But if I am in my reading, I find in Tirukural and Kautilya, fear is not there. There's more of love. So he says he surely could succeed in his effort, but the Kural. So Gandhi probably could not succeed in his effort. So did Tirukural. However, the seed-like ideas is powerful, and the time for it has now come. So let's go to Arnold Toynbee, who worked in Chatham House in the 50s. He tells us that one needs to get rid of the karma, that is the effect of past action on present action, that institutions of war have accumulated by effects of past acts. So he's got the problem, he's got the bull by the horn. He says you get rid of the karma of the past actions of war, which is for 3,000 years, we are at it, always at it. So this is the new challenge. And then Radhakrishna's understanding of Gita tells that the relation of science to humanities may be stated roughly to be one of means to ends. In our enthusiasm for means, we should not overlook the ends. The concepts of right and wrong do not belong to the sphere of science. Mathematics, science does not know right and wrong, by the way. Yet, it is on the study of the idea centering around these concepts that human action and happiness ultimately depends. So rather what Radhakrishnan was saying, that science does not know dharma. Humans know dharma. Okay. It's got stuck. Just sorry. Last but one slide. Stop. Skip previous slide to this. Previous slide. Yeah. So last slide is central. The conclusion is central is the human understanding and agency of dharma, which cannot be outsourced to robots, and I mean AI. Understanding and creating new knowledge of Indic traditions will contribute positively to world peace and security in the long term. And Indic texts and traditions inform domestic and foreign policy and military culture needs to be revisited, revived, and reflected deeply to sustain the rich and futuristic ethical and moral values and principles that all of us have in our subconscious minds or habitus called dharma. This new restless dharma is to be our passion of thought, speech, action, and writing, just as in the lecture by Vashishta to teenage Ram in his Yoga Vashishta, the dharma's wind's dharma is to be restless. And in the last slide, I want to share some literature. In the Sikh military craft, Baba Buddha was the teacher of the gurus. So he had made the Buddha Dal, that is the senior citizen, the elderly, and the Tarun Dal. So this is basically for the Tarun Dal. From the Sikh warcraft, Tarun Dal and the senior, the Buddha Dal knows everything, but my target is the Tarun Dal. So you'll be happy to know, a lot of work has happened. The rigor of scholarship, as Professor Amitabh Mattoo was saying and others, this is the research which has already happened. So Deepshika Shahi has written, international or not, being human is being global, in that edited book. Second is Shani and Navnita Behra have written an article on reading of Dharma. Then Scornidir China in their UK journal has written Moral Foundations of Military Ethos in India. And I have written, this was a Spanish journal about 6 years ago, Moral Aspects of Statecraft. And in the end, for the Tarun Dal, this is the new edition. New makers of modern strategy, from ancient world to digital age. Hal Brandt's edited. First was in World War I, World War II, 42. Second was 1986, edited by Bernard Brody and Peter Parrott. This is the latest one. And it has got the introduction by the editor. Says, but if Napoleon, who mastered the use of violence, led his country to ruin, Gandhi, who mostly abhorred violence, helped lead his country to freedom, then surely that tells us something about what qualifies as strategy after all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Gautam. Thank you for particularly presenting the ideas of dharma in the context of conflict and war, because that is less spoken of. It's been a wonderful panel. I think that we are out of time because the next session is taking place immediately. Okay, question. Yeah. I just want to sum up one point which I think runs through what all three speakers said, which is that the debate between values and interests needs to be re-evaluated in the in the context of Indian strategic thought, because all of them in their own way said if we protect values, our own values, our interests will also get automatically protected. So I believe we have time for one or two questions, and our panelists, Dr. Narlikar and Dr. Mattoo, are also on the line. So if anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. And please introduce yourself also while asking the question. Thank you.
Hello panel, Wali Rahman Rahmani from Afghanistan. I believe that one benefit of George Tanham essay in 1992 is that the Indian think tank and scholars realized the importance and need of documenting the evolution of the strategic thoughts of India. So I just have a question from Professor Amitabh, that George Tanham has specifically, when I've gone through his essay, I have wrote down 4 points. He have mentioned that the Indian geography leads to defensive mindset. And the second point, that lack of political unity which leaded to the foreign invasion. And the third point, he has mentioned that the Indian culture, where he has pointed to the Hindu view of rebirth, where if I'm correctly pronouncing Mandala Siddhant, he has just referred that also that has also affected the India strategic thought or culture, and as well as the British rule, which has led to the lack of indigenous strategic concept. So, one more short question. What is your view about all these 4 points? And one more short question, that is war basic core looking at the strategic thought, or is it not part of strategic culture to be defensive? As Kotalia has rightly mentioned, under the mission or under the purpose of the state, that it is to protect and promote. So,
Thank you. Amitabh, you would like to take that question? You're on mute again.
Yes, if I may, Ambassador. My friend from Afghanistan is right, and when he accurately points out the 4 different elements of Tanham's thought, or why he thinks that India doesn't have a strategic culture or a proper thinking on strategy because of its geography, lack of political unity, Hindu belief in karma and reincarnation, and British colonialism. I just think that it's a gross generalization. Many countries have had a similar history of political patricide, of geographical differences, as well as some degree of humiliation in colonialism, including China. My problem with Tanham is that it's a very selective view of understanding Indian history. It's a selective view because he does not take account of the geographical diversity. The one general who expanded the geography of India, in fact, in this audience, you wouldn't know, is General Zorawar Singh, who extended it into Tibet. Is Tanham aware of who George Tanham was? Secondly, it's on view of a selective view of history also, because it glosses over the Mughal period. It doesn't even take into account the many diversities in the Deccan, as you pointed out, Ambassador, in your opening statements. So, frankly, it's simple. Yes, I think what my friend from Afghanistan is right is that it provoked a lot of people. But if you require octogenarian from Rand Corporation, retired, living in Delhi, to provoke you, that says a lot about us than about George Tanham.
Thank you, Amitabh. Any other question? There's one more at the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Karthik Kumar Pathak, and currently I am also studying political science and international relations. As ma'am talked about the values and interests, and also Mr. Gokhale sir has left us in the end with the thought of values and interests. Do you actually believe in this world, in the contemporary times that we are living in, that the countries globally, other countries apart from India, are putting values, are prioritizing values more than interests? And if not, is it pragmatic for India to put their values before their interests? If that is not being done by the other countries, will not India lose in the race of acquiring the resources and land that all the countries in the world are going for? Thank you.
Amrita, would you like to take that?
Absolutely. That is a brilliant question. And the answer, are other countries working according to values? Well, some of our competitors clearly are not, right? And also sort of we can criticize the EU, which loves to pride itself as a, soft power, diplomacy, normative power, etc., etc. But the crux of your question, your name is Karthik. Karthik, yeah. Karthik, the crux of your question is, won't India or any other country lose out if they pursue the pathway of values and others pursue the pathway of interests, right? And my answer to this is, it depends on how you define values. If you accept the dichotomy, or if you think about values as something like, oh, the public good, then of course, right? And it relates also to the question, one of the questions that Ambassador Gokhale posed on how do leaders decide what values they are pursuing, right? And so, but if you think about values in the way that I think the Bhagavad Gita tells us, right? The way, which is that values and interests are actually mutually constitutive, that there is no dichotomy, it's a non-dualistic perspective on the world, right? And so if you accept values as not, oh, just doing some public good and hurting your own people, that's not diplomacy, that's not democracy, that doesn't work, that shouldn't happen. But if the pursuit of values actually reinforces your interests, that is different. And one can envisage a world where the pursuit of a value like democracy is very different from what China is pursuing, right? But it is something that the US and India can align on, right? So it really sort of, the crux of the issue is how you're defining values. And if you can go, if you can envisage a world where values and interests come together, then we don't have that problem.
Thank you, Dr. Narlikar. And now I want to thank the panel, Dr. Narlikar, Dr. Mattoo, and Colonel Gautam, for really making this a very, very interesting session. It could have been a terribly boring topic, but I think it is a very interesting session that happened. And I want to thank all the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Narlikar, Professor Mattoo, and Colonel Gautam for such an enlightening discussion. And a special thanks to Shri Vijay Gokhale for chairing and facilitating the session on the various dimensions of statecraft. I would request the Pro-Chancellor of Symbiosis National University, Dr. Vidya Ma'am, to felicitate the panelists.
You'll have to do it virtually.
So, ma'am, we'll have these couriered to you as soon as possible.
That's very kind. Thank you.